Hi, everybody.
Good evening, Phil. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Just checking a couple of things. Just checking who's got the Mahaba network. Am I co-hosting? Sorry about this. Just checking a couple of things. We'll be letting people in and getting started shortly.
Take your time, Phil.
How's everyone doing? Where are you all from? That would be quite nice, actually, if people could, after their name, put what city they're in, what town, you know, just to add to the interest. Okay, and okay, I think the host is being transferred to me. Oh. So let me start by renaming myself. A little button where you can rename, or Andrew's already done it. There we go. I know there's at least one other person from Woking. We've got Margaret's from the whole of Wiltshire. Well done. Gail is in Buffalo. Is that Buffalo in? Yeah. Where's Buffalo?
New York.
New York State.
New York State, yes. And Elizabeth's in Florida, I know that. We're just putting where we are, everyone. Matthew's somewhere. Are you on the road, Matthew? Are you?
I'm currently doing the dishes in Worcester, so that's why I'm muted.
It's a spiritual sacrifice doing the dishes. Well done. So yeah, if you'd be happy to put your city or your town.
Actually, we can all just watch Ray's video of Isla. I think that's going to be far more pleasant just to sit and watch the beautiful view of Isla there. I think that's you win, Ray, hands down. That's just.
Is Ray on Isla? Oh, yeah, Ray Skinner. Yes. Hello, Ray. I went to visit you. I'm sure. Was that in Isla? No.
Probably in Morden or Tunbridge Wells.
Okay. No, I went to visit someone in Isla. It's wonderful.
Oh, well, probably Andrew. The Baptist minister here called Andrew.
I'm pinning it so everyone can see your garden or whatever it is.
the holiday house.
Okay. How about that?
Yes, I'm looking to see Andrew Burnham. I think he teaches at Spurgeon's.
Okay, wonderful.
But he's the Baptist minister here at Isla, so what a mixture, eh?
So at the moment, who do we think? Isla's quite a long way away, but I think Buffalo may be, or even Florida, that may be further. So the prize is probably going to Elizabeth in terms of distance. Elizabeth or Gail? Okay, do we know how many people are coming on, Ray? Not Ray, sorry. Karamat.
I think this is probably it.
Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. Well, a couple of things. I'm going to hand over to Karamat and to Andrew, and they're going to have their conversation. in the button at the top right, I'll try and pin both of them. I don't know if you can pin two, but we'll try and get you both in there. You can always, in the top right of your screen, you can always press speaker rather than gallery. So then you at least get that one person who's speaking up big. One of the etiquettes is, if you don't mind, and most of you are doing that already, if you can mute. The meeting is being recorded. If you don't want your face to appear, then you'll have to stop video. It doesn't stop everyone's video, it's just yours, your face. And can I encourage you to use the chat? You can chat with people, but also put questions that occur to you as they're talking. It's really helpful, because then when Karamat asks questions, we can feed them into him, and even invite you to express the question yourself towards the end. So those are a few rules of etiquette. Really looking forward to Smee being grilled in the hot seat by Karamat, and what one comes out of this evening. I really enjoy this type of meeting, because you never know what's going to happen, and there's always something very special, very precious. So over to you guys.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Let me get the title right. Canon Dr. Andrew Smith.
Very good. Well done.
Also known as Smee. With your permission, I'll either use Smee or Andrew.
Yeah, either's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Put aside momentarily your titles. Your
Absolutely.
Titles. Are you enjoying the Kashmiri weather?
Yeah, while it lasts. Although it's terrible for hay fever. So other than that, it's good.
Oh well, you can't have it exactly as you'd like. So let's get started. Let's start with the Holy Book, our Holy Book. What do we learn from the Bible about ethnic diversity?
Yeah, good question. I think a really important one to grapple with, that all the recent discussion in society, but particularly within the church, about race and equality and representation, I think has made us all have to, I hope, really relook and rethink about what we mean, what we do, how we behave, who we include. And so it's really important. And I think in work amongst other faiths, this is often just a kind of, it has, I think, in the past often been a bit of a side issue, ethnicity and race. And I think it needs to come right into the fore. I'm sure for some people that would say, no, it's always been there. It's just never really been talked about very much. And obviously one can easily pull up, verses from Revelation around, there will be, there I saw a great multitude of witnesses from every tribe, language, nation and peoples. I'd like to know, I wrote something about that this afternoon. I don't want to make you think like I just can randomly quote bits of the Bible very easily. I just happened to write about this afternoon. And of course, one of the things that I'm sure we all know, but it's really important to remind people, is most of the Bible was written in a really mixed context. Most of the time, the people of Israel were living in and amongst people of different nations and different tribes, and most of the New Testament is written in that kind of context. So in one sense, it isn't as explicit as we might think, because it was just a given that the world was really mixed and there was all sorts of people around. The kind of context of Britain, kind of up until the kind of the start of the last century, although we're now learning that it was more mixed than we might have been taught at school, the fact that it was overwhelmingly white and nominally Christian was quite an unusual. Historically, that's quite unusual. Those kind of very monocultural places, I would argue. So in some senses, we just read the Bible kind of, it is just in that context, rather than trying to find, verses that kind of affirm that. I'm sure we can all think of them. But I think the important thing is to think, whenever we read it, whenever we engage with it, the vast majority was written assuming there were all sorts of people in and around the place who we should love and affirm and care for and engage with. And I think where we read the challenging stuff in the Old Testament, I don't want to spend the whole evening on that. An awful lot, there's debates around the right to land and all those disputes from the Old Testament, but also that sense of the criticism of not necessarily other religions but other religious practices that I think often come in for kind of challenge. But I think the affirmation that the world is diverse and that's just a given, and I think it's not insignificant. I'll end with this point, that kind of the first thing the Holy Spirit did was to get the disciples to speak in different languages. And I think that is really significant in itself for all sorts of reasons. But let us always hang on to that was the first thing the Holy Spirit did, was not get everyone to understand them, and while they spoke one language, he got the disciples to speak other languages. Or she got the disciples to speak other languages, might say.
Okay, thanks for that, Andrew. I think it's clear, certainly I've been here 50 years, it's clear that we live in a diverse society. Certainly major urban areas are extremely diverse. I happen to be in an area which is referred to as super diverse, the city of Birmingham, where there are over 200 different communities and languages being spoken. How important is it for us to understand the diverse communities that surround us, and how can we acquire such understanding?
Good point. And I think one of the reasons I love living in Birmingham is there's always someone new to find, to meet, a new community, a new faith group, a new denomination, a new sect, a new nationality. There's always someone new kind of around the corner to meet. But actually, for most of us, whilst we might live in very diverse places, often the areas we minister in might be actually not that diverse. There might be 2 or 3 different communities in an area. And actually, I think it is really important in any context to get to know the people you're kind of ministering amongst, you're talking to. And I think that deep understanding, kind of, in a sense, their history, their stories, their culture, their theology and their thinking. And one of the things, and some of you have heard me say this before, but my thing is that it's really important, I would suggest, that the people we need to get to know are the people stood in front of us. And there's an awful lot of good reading we can do and a good bit of research, but the people in front of us might not have done that bit of reading themselves. They might not come from that particular bit, or their parents might not have told them that story. They might have told them a different story. And we need to engage with the people in front of us. And so you'll find, for example, there are various different, Muslims will tell you different reasons as to why they take the shoes off going into a mosque, or why women wear headscarves, or all sorts of different issues. They'll have different cultural things about it. And whilst we can say, oh, I heard another Muslim believe this, actually we're engaging with a Muslim in front of us who believes this particular thing, or thinks music is banned or is good, or is banned, but I get away with it because my parents don't know, and it's that person we need to get to grips with. And the other thing is that people change and communities change. And I'm always conscious that actually, am I living off 5-year-old information? Have I gone out and found out who's actually in the area we're in now? Some of our areas in Birmingham used to be very white and are now quite mixed. Some used to be very Pakistani and are now quite mixed because the East Europeans moved in, or other groups have moved in, have become more Catholic than they used to be when they used to be overwhelmingly Muslim. And not everyone's always spotted those kind of things. And it's easy to just go on, well, we know who's here, but actually, do we really know? I'll end with this little tip that I heard. I was listening to a sociologist, a German sociologist, a few years ago from Berlin, and he'd done a project where he lived in a very diverse area of Berlin, and he'd walk down his high street once a month, very intentionally, very slowly, and looked at every sign and every notice in every shop and every building down the street to look at what languages were being written. And he said it was fascinating because you'd have the languages you expect to be there. Then one day you'd see a tiny little card in a shop in a new language. And he'd clock it and then try and see, because he was a linguist as well, he'd know which language it was. And then he'd see that suddenly you'd see 2 or 3 more of those signs. And then maybe you'd see a poster in the shop in that language. and then you'd see a photocopied poster in that language, and then you'd see a shop from that country selling goods, and he could spot the shifts just by watching what was written. And whereas everything might have once been in Turkish, now only half of it was in Turkish and more of it was in Romanian or Urdu. But that detailed looking, even without having to go and talk to people, I thought was a really interesting way of just plotting and seeing what was happening around him. But it was an intentional piece of work, and he could see how things just kept on changing. So you might want to do that, but there's other ways of basically trying to keep up with it, because it's very easy to get out of date.
Yeah, thank you for that. Now, I've been a Christian for 25 years, and during that time I've met with a range of Christians. And in the early days, I think I was surprised to come across people who didn't believe in sharing their faith with others, talking about it, and they just wanted to keep it to themselves. And then I've also come across people who would happily share their faith, talk to people, evangelize, etc., to people who are like themselves, of their own community. But recently I'm discovering that they don't want to go anywhere near groups like Muslims. So what would you say we are called to do by the Great Commission that we're given about people such as Muslims and many other faiths, people of other faiths? How are we to respond if we want to fulfill the commission that we're given?
Yeah, I mean, again, a brilliant question, really important. And I think, like you, I've met all sorts of Christians, from those who really want to tell people really very forcefully, to those who want to tell people but don't really know how to do it or feel intimidated, to those who feel that the best way to witness is through the daily celebration of Mass in their, or the Eucharist in their churches, to others who would say it's about being out there doing stuff, to others who would say, no, it's not our job to evangelize, it's for others to kind of find their own path. So the whole range of views on this one. I'm a believer in the Great Commission, but I also think, as with all of Scripture, it goes alongside everything else. And I think it's, for my mind, it's holding, in a sense, the Great Commission alongside the Great Commandments as a piece. So, you know, the fact that we're called to love God and love our neighbour, as, you know, those two always go together. The Great Commission, to my mind, is something that ought to flow out and into those things. So when we do the Great Commission, it ought to come out of so much love that it's done in a loving way. And actually, we should do it because we love our neighbour, and because we love God. We want to talk about God and live God's way. And as we love our neighbour, then they show us something of God. And as we do the Great Commission, we trust in God and we're drawn closer to God. So it all kind of keeps wrapping around each other and feeds on each other. My concern is when we separate them out and think, well, I'll love my neighbour on a Monday and I'll love God on a Tuesday, and I'll go and do the Great Commission when I'm on the rota or on Thursday. I was once shouted at by a young guy who was about to become a church leader, talking about loving your neighbour. And I've told this story many times, forgive me if you've heard it, but he did point his finger at me and shout at me to say, this love stuff's all very well, but I thought we were told to share the gospel. And I said, well, until this moment, I didn't realise the two were separate. I thought it was all part of the same thing. I had no idea that they were separate entities. And I think too often, sadly, they are. I think some of the the unethical ways of evangelism, and some stuff has been done, I would argue, unethically, has been done because the love bit's been lost. And the thinking of, when I move away, when we end this conversation, does the person in front of me feel as loved and valued as they did when I arrived, or even more so, or do they feel belittled or insulted? As many of you know, 10, 11 years ago, I wrote the ethical guidelines for witness for the Christian Muslim Forum, which absolutely tried to put these things together to say, how do we share our faith honestly and with integrity, but in a way that leaves the other person with their own integrity intact? And to my mind, that's how we put those things together. That I enter into this with my integrity. So I want to share with you the good news of Jesus because I love it, and I love him, and I want to tell you about it. if you want me to tell you. But at the end of this, you're not going to feel coerced or manipulated or insulted or ridiculed. And if you want to change your mind, you'll do that because you're in control of that decision. You've got your integrity intact in the way you're making the decision. And I've left with my integrity intact, that you haven't insulted me or I haven't denied who I am in the process either. So I think that's a kind of, for me, that's a fundamental principle, whoever we're working with. And that's what good. And I've seen all sorts of ways that happens well and not well. I've been really challenged. What was a church in Birmingham who will describe themselves as liberal Catholic and will say quite clearly, we don't do evangelism. They've got more Iranian converts than almost any other church in Birmingham. And through their witness of and their serving, and through the ritual and the liturgy, Iranians have been drawn to that church and have become followers of Jesus, even though they don't do any direct evangelism. So sometimes evangelism and converts don't actually, they sometimes need uncoupling. There can be a lot of evangelism without many converts, so sadly we know, and there can be some converts without any evangelism. So the two don't necessarily go together, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. But sometimes it's worth recognizing that the two can happen distinct from each other. So yeah, I'll stop there so I can go on.
Okay. I think in one of your books, you talk about Muslims. I think you quote Colin Chapman, and you refer to Muslims as modern-day Samaritans. How did you get involved with Muslims in your work, through your work in Birmingham? Was this when you describe Muslims as modern-day Samaritans?
Thanks. And that actually picks up, there's a question from Phil Simpson, which I'll pick up there. How come you end up working with Muslims and specialising in interfaith engagement? And how has your faith been changed and challenged by encounter with Muslims? I mean, I got into this because I got a job with Scripture Union as a schools worker when I was 28. I'd never met a Muslim until I was 28. So I came to this very, very late. And I hope you're all thinking that was only 3 years ago. It wasn't. It was a lot more than 3 years ago. But I got a job in schools to go and tell children about and pupils about, you know, in collective worship in lessons. And the schools that invited me in were full of Muslims. So it was no great calling. There was no great Andrew. It was literally I got a job and I had to go and discover working with Muslims. And because I was young and evangelical, the advantage of being a young evangelical and probably a young evangelical man is that you always know you're right, which doesn't mean you are right by any means. That's very different, but you know you're right, completely different. So when the school said, can you help me? I went, well, of course I can. And then I haven't got a clue. So I went off and learned about Islam and persuaded Scripture Union to send me to Pakistan, which is in sort of 97 or somewhere. But it was in a sense, the doors were open for me. And then I really had a sense of God's calling kind of after that, rather than I've got a calling now, I'm going to go and do it. It was very much a kind of stumbling into it, as it were. And then so how do we end up special and interfaith engagement? Again, it was doors that opened. That I was, you know, working with Scripture Union. We didn't do interfaith stuff, and I went along to Faith, Power and Society, was it, with Lamy Sameh and others back in the day, as the first experience, and discovered that actually it wasn't a place of compromise or syncretism, but a place where we could keep our own integrity and share deeply, and was really appreciated. That's how I got into that, and then the whole thing is developed. But I think this thing about Samaritans is, in a sense, there are very few passages in the Bible where it's clearly, I'm now standing in front of someone of a different faith. I mean, we could point to Jesus and the Roman centurion, arguably. No doubt, I mean, presumably he was worshipping kind of various Roman gods. There are various passages in the Old Testament, obviously, but the one place, arguably, is with the Samaritans. And I think the parallel, as many of you know, is quite interesting, is that they are not completely other in the kind of way that we might see Hindus who have no kind of direct scriptural links with Christianity. Samaritans have that kind of link. They've got a kind of a route back towards where the Jewish people were coming from, and yet they were distinctly other. They worshipped differently. They had different cultural practices and were clearly seen as a threat or a group to be avoided, or certainly unclean, not the people you hang around with. All descriptions that I have certainly encountered Christians describing Muslims as. And yet this undeniable link, and how we want to describe that link with Muslims, but look, Muslims would certainly define that link with us. And so there is, I think, these really interesting parallels of the way that a group that God's people, if you like, the Jewish people, and most of us as Christians would describe ourselves as God's people, this group who God's people really struggle to get on with, partly because of the closeness in their culture and in the kind of the faith tradition, but also found them intimidating and a group to be avoided. And Jesus' model was, we're going to walk, and so you're down the road where you're going to encounter Samaritans. I'm going to take you, and you're going to meet Samaritans, and then I'm even going to hold one of them up as a good example, not just as loving your neighbor, but if I want to be really controversial, I love the fact that that parable starts not with who is my neighbor, but what must I do to be saved? And the person Jesus says who gets it right is the Samaritan. I think it's a really challenging parable, actually. But Jesus constantly pushes the Samaritans to the fore. He doesn't see them as a threat. He doesn't see them as intimidating, as people to be avoided, as unclean. And I think if we can get into that attitude and say, clearly there is some kind of linking-y thing with us and Muslims, and certainly they would see that historically, and yet for so many Christians, the Christians feel intimidated, or are they people we should be mixing with? And I've had, I'm sure we all had Christians saying those things to us, and yet that example of Jesus says, not intimidating because God's going with us, and I'm deliberately going to take you to those places where you're going to meet them, and I'm going to show that they can do good and hold them up. Not all of them en masse, but I'm going to say I can even show you that they can be an example to us, which I think actually leads in quite nicely to what can we learn from encountering the followers of Islam. I mean, in a sense, I've learned all sorts of things. It depends which Muslim I'm thinking of, good things and negative things. But the overriding thing I've learned from encountering Muslims and is actually the importance of the fact that God loves us and we should love other people, which I know that I should have known that. I'm a very slow learner, but I came to this from a really conservative kind of background where it was all about the preservation and the proclamation of truth. And if we could only proclaim the truth clear enough and loud enough and logical enough, everyone would agree with us. And what I discovered was you could say it as loudly as you like, and the Muslims I met just went, yeah, but I don't agree with that. And you can repeat it till you're blue in the face. And they go, but I still think the Bible's corrupt, so I'm not interested. But when I stopped and thought, so how do I love these Muslims and how do I show them that? And then went back to scripture and realized how I'd overlooked how often the Bible talks about God's love for us and our love for others. It brought me up short to realize that that was a part of my faith that I'd downplayed or not put to the fore, even though I said I would. It really made me rethink, how do I do ministry based out of my love for these people and not just out of I want to win an argument. That's the thing that they've really taught me.
Yeah, thank you. I think in my time in the Christian family, I've observed, particularly with older Christians, that they lead fairly parallel lives from some other communities, Muslims, and they grew up at a time when we weren't such a diverse society, but obviously things have changed. And for young people, diversity is very much bread and butter, daily existence at school, college, university, in the workplace. I think you talk about in one of your books how we're going to equip Christian young people to live out their faith in our diverse community. Would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, and I think this is really vital. And I've spoken at churches in kind of rural areas who have said, there's no Muslims around here. This is nothing to do with us. And then I'll say, so have you got any kind of young people? And the churches that have, And I'll say, are they going to go to university? Well, yes, of course they will. And I say, so when they get to university and on day one, they see the large Islamic society, what are you doing to prepare them for that encounter? And when two of the people in their halls of residence sharing their flat with them are Muslims, have you prepared them for what they're going to say to those Muslim friends on the first day they get there? And of course, the answer tends to be, oh no, I hadn't thought about that. So I would say, actually, this is crucial. One of the things that made me think about this years ago, I remember walking into a bank in Birmingham and realizing that behind the counter was a Hindu lady, a Muslim guy, and a white, I don't know whether he was secular or Christian, but that was just normal working life in a place like Birmingham. I thought, if you live in the kind of rural edges of Birmingham as a keen Christian and you got a job going, well, hey, I've got a job at the bank, isn't this exciting? You would walk in and be expected to be able to get on with a Hindu and a Muslim instantly. That's the expectation in society now. You'll be able to do that. It won't be a threat or a challenge. And so there's a bit of a, if we're going to equip young people in our churches to be effective citizens, able to contribute and make a difference across all walks of life, it's no good them walking into a bank if they're working there or a building site and being intimidated by the fact that their close colleague is a Hindu or a Sikh or a Muslim, because they'll just be accused of prejudice when they've got to get on with it. So there's a real practical bit about life, but also this is how we are going to be living our Christian life in Britain from now on. I mean, I used to spend my time with Christians telling me they thought the Muslims were going to take over the country. I now have a lot of Hindu friends telling me that, but anyway, I don't believe it. But what I don't think many of those people are thinking of is Nadia Hussain on the Great British Bake Off, or Mo Farah or Mo Salah at Liverpool, or the various MPs, some of whom are really quite good, or, you know, we've got a number of MPs of different faiths in Birmingham, and some of them are really very good. And I don't think that's who people are thinking of, but that's the reality. That's the reality, is that we constantly see kind of just people getting on with being British of other faiths as the reality of the life around us. And we need to be equipping our children and young people to go, this is how we're going to be living as Christians from now on, because they're here, and I'm very glad they're here. I don't think many of them are going to go anywhere for anytime soon. This is now the reality, and it's no use pretending otherwise. So we need to do that, and I think that needs to start with children. So I do an online Sunday school on a Sunday afternoon on Zoom, which is hilarious. But that's some of the things that we've been thinking about, and particularly things like, what images are we showing? Are we showing the church to be full of people who are Asian and Black and Caribbean and Pakistani and Indian, or do we only show Christians as white people? Is that what we're helping our children grow up with? It was brilliant this last Sunday when we talked about Philip and the Ethiopian, and two of the children, their family, they'd been to Ethiopia on holidays. So they showed us their holiday photos of the churches in Ethiopia, so we could show the children this direct line between Philip and the Ethiopian and a church today. And it really got them intrigued. So it's really important, because this is the reality. And I think that, so we're going to need to do this and help them see that actually it's okay to do this. So yeah.
Okay. The Bible, I've got a Bible on my iPad, and it's like a PDF, and so all of the words and verses that talk about justice are highlighted, and every now and then I read those, and they're quite powerful. But we don't often talk about it, and I wonder sometimes how that sort of thing should influence our attitude towards racism and Islamophobia, because majority of the Christians are white and have privileged access to places, to institutions, structures, systems where racism and Islamophobia may be going on. Maybe they are actually practicing it themselves. What do you think our response should be toward, you know, on Islamophobia? What should we do? Should we take a stand?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we should be calling it out, whether it's Islamophobia, whether it's racism, whether it's anti-Semitism, absolutely. And I think young people often are ahead of us on this. Those of us older, I think the church should be, some churches are. The churches in Birmingham have, the sort of churches together in Birmingham have done some really strong statements recently around racism, but statements are easy. It's what we do that's the challenge. So yeah, do the statements, and the world wants the statements. But my question is, a year later, has anything changed in your churches? That's the big question. So lots were doing stuff on Black Lives Matter last year. My question to any church who did that last year is, so what are you doing now? Can you spot any difference? And I think standing up for any minorities. There's a rabbi from New York, Mark Schreier, I think his name is, who's quite an outrageous, outspoken rabbi who I've got to know. But his thing is unless we speak up for the rights of others, we've got no right to speak up for our own rights. And he's done a lot challenging Islamophobia in New York as a Jewish person. And I think he's absolutely right. I think too often when we shout, we want rights, we want our rights, and we're not really bothered about other people's rights. And there's nothing more powerful than someone else saying, I'm going to call out Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, and making that statement and stand, but then doing something about it. And I think, we all know that the other thing, around LGBT kind of prejudice as well. And that's something that now, and you talk to young people about that, and I've got 2 lads at university, and they're just like, what's the issue? Why would anybody be prejudiced? It's not even an issue. So what are you going on about? So I think they're often ahead of us, and there's a lot to learn from young people. But I think, the church, it's one of those things, you can read the Bible, and like I discovered, I should have known it's full of love stuff. There's a lot of justice stuff in there. But it's easy to sit back and think, well, that's an end of time thing, when I'm not sure that, well, it is, but it's also a now thing as well, I think. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. A couple more questions. We're obviously blessed with hundreds of thousands of people from minority faiths. If they suddenly decide to become followers of Christ one day, in large numbers, how ready would you say we are as a church?
Yeah, that would be a bit. I really hope God does that one day, just for the laugh, really, just see what would happen. Just to kind of, you said you wanted this, here you go. I remember doing this with churches about youth work years and years ago, when I was doing stuff about youth work, saying, if I got you 200 teenagers to join your church, would you cope? And they all freaked out and went, oh, no, we're not sure, we're not. So I think the church has often been, we want converts one at a time, so we can cope. So no, I don't know whether it would be. I think some churches would be, and I think people would find the churches who do say, come on in, welcome. And those churches would probably grow, and I think people would very quickly find the ones that weren't. I really hope we've learned the lessons from Windrush. As you'll all know, the reason we have, I'm not sure if everyone knows this, but the reason we have so many black-led churches now is because many of the Pentecostal Christians from the Caribbean who were Anglicans came over in the 50s and 60s and were turned away at the door by fellow Anglicans. Outrageous, appalling racism that we're still living with. I fear that some churches would find that. I was running a dialogue thing. This is a moment of good news. I was running a dialogue thing a couple of weeks ago on faith in. We did one on business, one on law, and one on politics. And the law one, I had a Jewish police chief superintendent and a Muslim solicitor who works for Anthony Collins, a Christian law firm in Birmingham. And she does a lot of training on charity law, particularly for churches. And she's a young Muslim lady with a headscarf. And someone said to her, do you face any prejudice? And she said, in the years I've been here, 3 or 4 years, none whatsoever. So actually, I've been to lots of churches and they greet me as a professional, and people have been friendly. And some people want to ask me about my headscarf because they think it looks beautiful, but I've only ever been welcomed. And everyone was a bit kind of, gosh, we weren't expecting that, but isn't that brilliant? Now that's in Birmingham, where people are probably fairly used to that. But are we ready for not just people coming in, but then coming in on their own terms? And Karamat, you'll know much more about this than me, but coming in and still being Pakistani. Yeah. With all the kind of family, cultural time stuff that means, and not just coming in and turning into white English people and doing it that way? What would it mean if our churches in parts of Birmingham were all led by Pakistanis?
Yeah.
Does our infrastructure allow for a way of running churches and doing organisation that isn't just a very white middle class way of doing it? There's a good question. But if the welcome's going to be there genuinely, it needs to be welcome and come on in at all levels, and not just come on in and sit there whilst those of us always been there do stuff to you. And I think that might be the bigger challenge, actually. I think if thousands came in together, I wonder whether that is how God will bring people to faith, so that actually whole communities come. And I'm sure lots of churches would say, welcome, it's lovely to see you. But whether the welcome would go beyond that to, and now we want you to learn from you and for you to be fully a part of the church, which means being in every level of leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I found on many occasions that decent white folk, many of Christians I would put in that category, there are some taboo subjects or subjects they're uncomfortable with. Racism is one. If you start talking about it, they feel that you might be accusing them of that. And the other thing that I've discovered, coming from a third world country, speaking a different language, learning English, people in the West, people in England, I think they're a bit better in Scotland and Wales. People in England don't like to learn other people's languages. And I think many of the minorities amongst us speak at least one other language. And I say to people, every time you come across somebody who doesn't speak the Queen's English, it's because they speak 2 or 3 languages. And they are good at some of those. And recently I brought a group of Christians together and said, you've been to Pakistan and places like that, you will have learned Urdu. Should we as Christians be learning Urdu in the UK? And so it's just a way of entering other people's shoes.
I say on the language one, I'll push back slightly there, because people have often said to me, why don't you learn Urdu? Until I meet my Hindu friends, and they said, why haven't you learned Gujarati? And then my Arabic friends have said, why haven't you learned Arabic? And then I've been asked why I haven't learned Hindi and why I haven't learned So I've kind of gone, do you know what, I'm going to learn. But when I worked in schools, I learned how to count to 10 in Urdu, which I can still do, which meant the pupils thought I could speak Urdu, so they stopped swearing at each other because they assumed I knew the rest of it. I only knew how to count to 10, but it was enough to get me, so they thought I could speak it. But I think there is something about meeting both ways. And I think, Karamat, you're absolutely right. What are we going to do to be welcoming, and as the hosts to be the ones who are the real welcomers? But actually, as each community comes in, how does each new community then become the hosts to the next community? And I think that's something for us to continue to work through. And the only other thing I would say, in some of our areas in Birmingham, we're now getting areas where, which were kind of characterized as kind of white working class, the kind of outer estate areas of Birmingham, that are now changing very rapidly. And one of my challenges to the church is to say, how are you going to hold the ground that says we welcome the new folk coming in, predominantly Muslims, and at the same time, we tell the indigenous folk, we love you and we don't want you to go anywhere because we value you too.
Yeah.
And too often that bit's been missing. And I know, Karamat, you've done a lot around stuff around white working class boys and all sorts of things. But I think too often that second bit's been missing, of saying to the folk already there, we value you, please don't go anywhere just because some new people are moving in. And so have been accused of a phrase I really hate, but the kind of white flight, as if the white people always have a kind of racist kind of lemming kind of thing, just all ran off, when actually some felt very pushed out. And also Caribbean folk left and Sikhs and Hindus have left. So actually there's been all sorts of movement for all sorts of reasons. But actually that sense of saying we're going to be the church that tries to make everyone in our area feel welcome. I mean, one of the things about the Church of England, if you're in the Church of England, of course, you have a parish and you're told that you've got the cure of souls of everyone in that parish. So I think that's actually a really good challenge to say, well, I've got a defined area, and as a church, we should be praying for and caring for everyone in this area, whether they've lived here for 80 years or 8 weeks. And I think for all of us in any tradition, that's a really good challenge. And I think that's part of it. It's not just welcoming the newcomer. And I was telling you, I think it was Matt the other day, I was saying this, the analogy, if we're not careful, we can be a bit like mobile phone companies or gas companies. We're really good at the new customers and you get all the good deals and all the best stuff. And the people who've been around for years, we take you for granted.
Yeah.
And there's a danger that we can be a bit like that.
Yeah. Okay, final question from me before I hand over to Phil. You will know our dear friend, Reverend John Ray from Pakistan, Kashmir, Birmingham, now living in the green and pleasant lands of Yorkshire. He's missing Birmingham. If I can give, first of all, give a plug, because on the 29th, I'm having one of these conversations with John. So if any of you are listening are free, you're welcome to join us.
And he will have a lot of wisdom. He is worth listening to. Trust me.
Yeah, well, that's what I had numerous conversations with him, and I was thinking, it's just one-to-one, you know, this should be shared with wider people. Anyway, John wanted me to ask you a question. It was along the lines of, are things changing? Are things getting better in terms of how Christians engage with Muslims and people of other faiths? And certainly, you know, John's missing Birmingham. He's left, and he's saying, you know, since I've left, are things better? Ask Andrew for me, will you?
I think yes. I think I meet fewer Christians who are intimidated or frightened of Muslims. I meet few who are kind of really very negative about Muslims in the way that I used to many years ago. Maybe they've just given up telling me these things and run away. I don't know. I meet far more Christians who genuinely want to know, how can we love our Muslim neighbours and how can we share our faith well with them? I meet more and more Muslims who want to spend time and are very happy to spend time with Christians. And that's a real positive. And actually, getting together with a group of Muslims is increasingly easy. It's not difficult. One of the things that's been really helpful over the last few years is the emergence of more assertive Muslim preachers in the city centre. So we now have 2 or 3 guys who turn up in the city centre. They put their kind of gazebo up, they get their loudspeakers out, they have Islamic sermons all day long and giving out free Qurans. And usually opposite them, some strident Christians turn up with a megaphone and they all stand there and shout at each other all day long. The poor shops, it must be a nightmare. But what it means is now that the subject of evangelism, of dawah and conversion is absolutely out there. So it's really easy to talk to my Muslim friends about conversion because they know that there are Muslims trying to convert people. There are mosques who are running courses for new converts, or reverts, as they would say. So I've said to some mosques, one day, wouldn't it be brilliant if we got a mosque and a church to run a course together for new believers? Wouldn't that be fun? And a few Muslims have gone, yes, a few years away yet, but yes, we'll get there. I couldn't have those conversations 10 or 11 years ago. So I think some good things there. I think the flip side, I think the discourse, the general discourse in the world, as you all know, has got far, far worse. Everything is far more polarized. And I think whether that's because of the effect of Brexit or Donald Trump or Twitter or whatever it is, but increasingly, everything you're either for us or against us. And we've seen that most recently in the issue about Israel-Palestine, the recent kind of conflict there. And trying to have any kind of nuanced conversation where we hold on to our friendships is really challenging. So that's the kind of negative. The more difficult conversations I'm having, to be honest now, are with Hindu friends, influenced by the Hindutva movement. That's a much more difficult conversation. Overall, I think there's some real positive stuff between Christians and Muslims, and increasingly between Muslims and Jews as well in Birmingham. There's some really good stuff going on there. So I think overall, I feel more positive. in terms of those relationships. In terms of society generally and those kind of things, I think I feel more negative than I did a few years ago. It feels like 2012 when we had the Olympics and all the buzz around that, and Barack Obama was in the White House. At the time, I thought, gosh, we've got a long way to go. Now it feels like those were the sunny uplands. I wonder if we'll ever get back to there again, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
But between Christians and Muslims, I think things, certainly in Birmingham, are a lot better.
Yeah, good. Okay, well, we've got about 10 minutes left. I've come to the end of my questions, so I'm looking to Brother Phil.
There was a technical one from Ray. I'll just answer that really quickly.
Yeah, sure.
Dr. Rick Oakes has recently published in his book and argues that the Quran does not deny the cross, that only after the Crusades did Muslims teach that someone else was crucified. How valid is it to engage with Muslim friends on this surah? I would say, if they know that stuff, then yes, but most Muslims, I think, would just go, never heard of that, that's not true, the kind of Muslims that I'm meeting. So if you're meeting Muslims who are au fait with that stuff, then I think that's worth talking about. Most Muslims I know are talking about where can we get decent pizza, or how does everyone know we can get a vaccine these days, whatever. Do you know what I mean? So I think it depends who you're talking to, and that's that thing about understanding. If you're talking to the kind of people who want to talk about that, yes, but talk to the people about the topics that they're interested in. And I'll just a quick anecdote while you're writing questions from years and years and years ago. I remember a young Muslim lad came up to me and goes, said, Andrew, can I ask you a really important question? And I thought, this is it. I thought, this is going to be my kind of little moment. And I went, yeah, go on. And he goes, what car should I drive to get girls to fancy me?
Yes.
And but that's him. That was his concern. The answer, I have no idea. That's outside of my skill set. But his concern was about relationships. And about how does he... So I need to talk about that. But Ray, if you're meeting people who know that stuff, yeah, go for it.
I think the question I didn't ask you, because I thought we were running out of time, was about multiple identities.
Yeah, actually, it's a really, before we come on to that one, Karamat, there's a really good one about iftars and things come up.
Okay, all right.
Alice there says, but there's lots of invitations to Christians to attend and even host iftars in Ramadan. How appropriate is this? What are the principles that would be good to share with churches? As someone who both hosts and attends a lot of iftars, I try and limit it now to 5 or 6 a year, because otherwise it gets slightly out of control. I think it's a good thing, but always I think it's thing about keep your integrity and allow the integrity of others. So actually, I organise one which Bishop David hosts an iftar each year. And the way we do that, he's got a very big house, but it's still not vast. We can have about 20 people there. He invites 10 clergy who can come on the grounds that they bring a Muslim friend with them. And it means that we don't have any kind of senior Muslims upset because the bishop hasn't invited them, because he doesn't invite any, he only invites his clergy. We get a real mix of people. And at the evening, we spend a time chatting and enjoying the sunshine or whatever and talking. We then have a discussion. The bishop will chair a discussion about fasting, and we'll prime a couple of people to talk about what that means in their thing, in their each tradition. We then have a prayer time, but we basically we say Muslims are praying upstairs, Christians are praying downstairs. If you don't want to pray, go and enjoy the sunshine. If you want to observe each other's prayers, you're allowed to, but we're going to pray on our own terms. We're not going to do a synchronistic prayer time. And then we come together for a meal and opening the fast and the meal afterwards. And that's been really appreciated. Now, not everyone would agree with that, but we found that's worked really well. And I've on the I mean, Karamat could share this, but the Church of England, if you Google Church of England other faiths, that's where their project called Presence and Engagement is now in the main Church of England website. And there's some advice on there about hosting or attending iftars. And my thing always is, keep your integrity. If you feel, actually, I'm being totally compromised, I hope actually most of the iftar, as you'll know, is eating food. And the prayer time, my thing would be is, you should never feel coerced to join in. And I've never been to one where I felt coerced to pray. The ones I've been led by Muslims, or actually they pray and I sit at the back. I went to one at a small mosque, a new mosque, and they'd got funny stuff that was covering the tables, kind of a tablecloth. It was plastic stuff. I realised it was wrapping, because one of them worked at a factory that puts the wrapping around tins of food. I kid you not, it was all wrapping for tins of ham, was the tablecloth at a mosque for an iftar event during Ramadan. What are you doing? He said, I'm redeeming it. I thought I'll make some good use of it and turn it into tablecloths for Ramadan. So,
okay. Any other
thanks for the link.
questions?
Thanks, Phil.
Okay. You've jumped in very quick, Andrew, and answered all the questions that are written up there. So an opportunity for people to raise a hand and ask one. But I'm going to kick off by asking, you did a major bit of work with the Christian Muslim Forum on guidelines for sharing faith between Christians and Muslims in Britain. Could you just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that came out when I was on the Christian Muslim Forum, I say about 11 years ago. And as so often happens in dialogue groups, and I go to a lot of dialogue groups all over the place, is you eventually get someone going, why don't we get the more conservative members of the faiths joining in these? And I'm forever saying it's because you don't engage with them on their terms. Particularly ones that come from a very liberal or pluralist tradition. And that was where the Christian Muslim Forum was in danger of heading. And I said to them, if we want to seriously engage with the evangelical churches or evangelical Christians and Muslims who want to do da'wah, we've got to engage with that topic. We can't pretend it isn't happening. And it's no good taking the line of it shouldn't be done, which a few people do, because those people who feel called to that, it is part of their faith. It's not a kind of an optional rucksack that they do sometimes, as I said earlier. It's core. And I think there's a really good question to be had, I argued, that the question is not should we or shouldn't we, but how do we do it? And that we can produce some stuff that says, we recognize that you're called to do it and would want to affirm your calling, but we want to challenge people to do it ethically, to do it in a way, this thing about where everyone you encounter feels that their integrity is intact at the end of the encounter. So to my great horror, they say, good idea, Andrew, go and write them. And I'm not an ethicist by any means. And I wanted it to be easily read. So I literally wrote 10 bullet points. So I sat there for a few hours, wrote 10 bullet points, took them to the group that was made up of Christians from all denominations and liberal, evangelical, whatever, and Muslims of all denominations. They discussed it in separate faith groups, and then we came together and discussed it. And to my utter amazement and slight shock, they agreed with almost everything I'd written. They tweaked one or two things, but very little. I haven't lived with them for a while. I can tell you the only one that didn't get changed at all was, I think it's number 10, that says we will, whilst we may feel sad, we'll allow people to convert without harassing them afterwards. Now, we actually had a white revert in the group, so I kind of knew there wasn't a way for them to get around that one, actually. So I was a little bit, I did get an awful lot of flack from some Christians for the one that says we won't ridicule or demean your faith. Some people thought that meant that therefore we couldn't question the validity of what the Prophet Muhammad might have said. And my argument was that when I encounter people ridiculing, demeaning, that isn't questioning, critiquing. It's the kind of derogatory comments. It's the kind of sneering contempt. That's what I was trying to get at in that guideline. But some people took it differently and got very upset. But I think that's kind of, I hope, past now. And they've kind of really taken off. I've been really surprised. Every so often I pick up a book and find them quoted and kind of used all over the place. So it's been a really interesting thing. But it was definitely, it was, Christians and Muslims together saying we can affirm this. So so that's where it came from. And So I think it's still something that's got use and validity. I think the Muslims are very conscious that they can only speak for Muslims in Britain by doing this. Actually, and they were very conscious that this isn't something for Christians in Britain to turn up in Pakistan or Iran and go, look, this has been signed, you've got to behave like this now. They had no authority to do that. And we were very clear that we couldn't abuse their kind of willingness to engage in the process by doing that. And I don't think that's ever, I'm not aware that's ever happened, but they were conscious of that.
Okay, we're running out of time, but having asked if anyone's got a question, stick your hand up. First served will get their question in. Or first, anyone have a question they'd like to ask Andrew? No one.
We've covered everything.
I think we covered everything. That's very exhaustive. Not exhausting, exhaustive. Well done.
Can I,
yeah.
Before I forget, the the whole point of this was to sell some books. So, vibrant Christianity in a multi-faith world. If I showed you how much I'd highlighted, all the highlighting, so, and then this one, my friend Imran, something you can probably read in the bath.
Can you get ready highlighted books? That would be really good.
No, you missed the point. So that's what started all this, because I every now and then read them and I'm thinking, well, we need to have a conversation that other people can be part of. And now that Zoom allows us this to have people from all over the world, especially America, so it's been great.
Brilliant. So as Karamat said, there's another interview happening on the 29th with John Ray. We look forward to him coming all the way down from Yorkshire again and joining us. And if you've got ideas of other people you would like Karamat to interview, then maybe you can suggest it. I'm going to suggest Matt Vaughan is interviewed by Karamat in terms of the books he's written on Pakistan. I think that'd be really, really interesting and helpful. I only know because we had a chat in for a cross in Woking, and that was brilliant. So maybe Matt, being I fairly recently returned via Malaysia. I called them returned empties. So Matt is a returned empty, and he might have some really interesting stuff to share. But if you've got other ideas, people you would like to be interviewed or you'd like to offer, then have a chat with Karamat.
Yeah, well, I better start reading Matt's other books. I've read one, and I have to read the books before I do the interview. So that's my summer reading sorted.
And then, of course, someone needs to chat with Karamat about his stuff. Yeah. Okay. So really good that you could all join us. This has been recorded. It will be accessible, and we'll let you know how, if you want to watch it again or share it with a friend. So thank you ever so much, Andrew.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah,
maybe
thanks very much.
Yeah,
thanks very much. Really good to see you all. Cheers. Thank you.
Yeah. God bless.
Bye.
Really good that everyone could join us this evening. Don't forget the 29th.
Great. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye. Everything okay, Ray? Sab kuch theek hai? I want to hear your voice. Come on, unmute.
Go on, John, you can unmute and say something.
And
Is that
Julia,
me?
nice to see you.
Hello.
Hello, John.
Can you hear me?
Ah,
course.
Yeah, it was absolutely brilliant hearing Smee.
Yes,
absolutely brilliant. I could say amen to, I think, every word. And yeah, talk about wisdom. You said I've got some wisdom. We all mess up sometimes.
Well, we're looking forward to hearing about some of your mess ups.
Oh, I'll tell you about one.
At the Dinner Biscuit School.
But the point is about him that is not talk, because
yeah, it's walk as well.
I remember may I tell you one story about Andrew Smith?
Yeah, sure.
Quick one. He invited me along to something in the